Behind me is the Place de la Concorde, located between the eastern terminus of the Avenue des Champs-Élysées and the Jardin des Tuileries in Central Palace, Paris. It originated during the reign of King Louis XV. This is in the early part of the 18th century. But during the French Revolution, really one of the most compelling events in human history, uh, this became known as the Place de la Révolution. And during the Reign of Terror, which I imagine most of you have heard of, it was here that the guillotine was set up that eventually executed King Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette, and thousands of others. So, what I want to do today is to talk to you first about the French Revolution itself, the political events of it, the ideology of it, and so on, and then move on to the art of war, in the age of Napoleon Bonaparte. Go ahead and share the screen with you. Okay, there we are. Here are the terms for today's lecture. By the end of this presentation, you should understand first the three stages of the French Revolution. Secondly, the revolutionary values of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Next, the fragility of republics. That is to say, republics are mortal, and as we're going to see, they can go away quite easily. Next, the ideology of nationalism and its importance in military affairs. Then Napoleon Bonaparte and his relationship to the French Revolution, followed by the foundations of Napoleon's art of war, and then finally, the reasons for Napoleon's ultimate defeat. Now, war suffuses the French Revolution. It's important to understand its political foundations and particularly its background, which in important kinds of ways tracks back to war. France was at war nearly continuously during the 18th century. Most recently, in a war to assist the American revolutionaries that led to extensive naval campaigns in both North America, the Caribbean Sea, and also in the Atlantic Ocean near Europe. Now, this painting shows the French fleet, it's at left, blocking the British fleet from entering Virginia's Chesapeake Bay. This happens in 1781. And the British fleet is trying to get into Chesapeake Bay so that it can rescue the British army under Cornwallis that is trapped at Yorktown in the late summer and early autumn of 1781. Now, a French army assisted the American Continental Army in defeating the British, and French military engineers supervised the siege operations that compelled the British surrender ultimately in October of 1781. And between this French naval effort and its military effort and all the gold that it gave to the Continental Congress to fight the war, which was perhaps France's most important contribution, the financing of the war. By the time the war ended, the Kingdom of France was in debt to the tune of $613 billion. It's translating those dollars into current dollars. And just paying the interest on that debt required 43% of the kingdom's annual revenue. Now, this put the King of France, Louis XVI, in a terrible bind. And for several years, his ministers, his sort of cabinet officials, as it were, tried to figure out a way to get out of this financial crisis. But it proved impossible, in part because France had an outmoded system of collecting taxes that was not only inadequate, but structured in such a way that it actually hindered economic activity. So the French economy generated less wealth and therefore less revenue than it should have done because of the tax system, which in many respects was the legacy of the medieval era. Now, these needed financial reforms were so great that Louis XVI was forced to do something that had not been done since 1614. call for the convening of what's called the Estates General, which is it's the Estates General. It's complicated. Very, very roughly, it was the equivalent of France's Parliament, but that is really roughly. And for 170 years, the kings of France have been able to rule just by themselves without any input, in effect, from the French people, but no longer. Now, this Estates General reflected a kind of medieval shorthand way to describe society as being composed first of the first estate, those who pray, the clergy, then the second estate, the nobility, the aristocracy, and then finally the third estate, composed of the commoners, who actually were the majority and who did most of the work in France. Now, the clergy and the nobility together accounted for just 3% of the kingdom's population of about 26 million in those days. The other 97%, 25.2 million people, were all lumped together as commoners. But these millions of people included wealthy merchants, bankers, lawyers, and other professionals, some of whom had greater wealth than some of the nobility. And until the under the 1614 arrangement of the Estates General, each estate met separately and exercised a single vote. The clergy had a vote, the nobility had a vote, and the third estate, the commoners, had a vote. And so, since the clergy consisted of powerful cardinals, archbishops, and bishops, and were as privileged, powerful, and wealthy as the nobility, it was obvious that if this system were used again in 1789, when the Estates General was convened, the commoners, the third estate, would have almost no leverage over the outcome. Now, intense discussions took place about creating a more equitable division of power. And ultimately, what happened was that there was no way to create a more equitable division in which the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners could agree. And so the commoners, the third estate, really took matters into its own hands. It refused to organize itself, so the Estates General could not do any business. And then ultimately, things got out of hand, and you get the first phase of the French Revolution. It goes through 3 phases. This is the first one. When the Estates General met in May 1789, as I've said, the third estate, the commoners, refused to be seated until it was agreed that the voting should be done by head, by individuals, so individual noblemen, individual clergymen, and so forth. And on June 17th, the third estate, the members of the third estate, voted to constitute itself a national assembly. They did this in the famous Oath of the Tennis Court. And finding themselves locked out of their regular meeting hall by royal officials, they met in this capacious indoor tennis court to swear an oath that it would not disband, that these members would not disband until France had a constitution. Well, on June 23rd, King Louis XVI offered a defense of his clergy and nobility and made veiled threats to dissolve the Estates General, to stop the third estate from its intended expanded view or expanded involvement in this Estates General. And the third estate exploded and said that the nation in assembly does not take orders. In other words, the nation in assembly, not the king, was the ultimate authority, the real sovereign. And at this point, a sympathetic nobleman and clergy joined this assembly, which now took the title of Constituent Assembly and empowered a committee to begin drafting a constitution. Now, it would take too long to discuss all the twists and turns that took place over the next 2 years. But broadly speaking, the revolutionaries sought to create a viable constitutional monarchy like the one that the Great Britain had, where the monarch functioned as head of state, but most political power lay in the hands of elected members of parliament. Now, here you see the festivities when this constitutional monarchy was proclaimed on September 3rd, 1791. Now, most revolutionaries were actually, during this stage, somewhat conservative in their view about who should hold political power in France. It could no longer be just the king and the nobility and the clergy and those with aristocratic privilege, but it was important, they thought, that power be limited to those with substantial property. And many revolutionaries were deeply skeptical about extending power to the masses, to those with little or no property. Now, if Louis XVI had gone along with the idea of a constitutional monarchy, the revolution might ended then and there, but he didn't. And in essence, the revolutionaries placed him under house arrest and tried to force him into that role, and ultimately found themselves unable to do it. Louis XVI actually tried to escape from France, go to Austria, and get the aid of the Austrian emperor. And ultimately, the position of the moderates who wanted this limited constitutional monarchy, uh, their position became untenable in what was now called the Legislative Assembly. Um, and so the Legislative Assembly first suspended Louis XVI from his functions and called for nationwide elections for a national convention to determine the fate of the monarchy. It also declared that all adult males were eligible to vote in the convention and thereby abandoned attempts to keep power in the hands of the property classes. Now, the ability to vote was greatly expanded within France. And this new convention, National Convention, first convened on September 20th, 1792, and the next day proclaimed the abolition of the monarchy, and France would henceforth be a republic. This, as many predicted, and as events would prove, uh, was going to be a very dangerous step to take.